Well, welcome to this webinar. I'm Heather Bradley, the Director of the Center for Nonprofit Resources. I'm really glad you decided to join us today. I'm here with Maggie Humphrey of the Toledo Bar Association and Craig Burns of Marshall Melhorn. We're so excited about the collaboration that we have developed with TBA to bring you expertise in the areas that you are most interested in legally as it relates to your nonprofits. Craig has generously offered his time. He's part of the pro bono group over at TBA. In fact, this is the third and final webinar for Craig that he has done for us in collaboration with us. The previous two are out on our blog if you want to go check them out. One was Anatomy of a Charity and Common Legal Issues Nonprofit Board's Experience. But today, and the way I like to grammatically pronounce this title is, So You Want to Start a Nonprofit. So without further ado, Craig, if you'd like to take it away.
Thank you. So this webinar is for people who are thinking about starting a nonprofit. We often get a lot of these calls. People come in, you've got a great idea, you want to start a nonprofit. So this will help you not only decide whether you should start a nonprofit, but also cover how you do that if you decide that's a good idea. Just as a little disclaimer, this is generalized advice. It superficially covers a wide range of topics. As such, it's necessarily oversimplified. In actual situations, the facts and circumstances can change the result. So you need to consult with competent legal counsel. In other words, if you see something on this slide and it suggests something, you can't just extend that and take it to the nth degree and assume that it necessarily applies to your situation. This presentation is about 501c3 charities, not other types of nonprofits. There are many different types of nonprofits, but if you're saying you want to start a nonprofit, you're probably talking about a charity. The other types of nonprofits have some similarities and also some important differences. There are other presentations in the series. The first one, Heather mentioned, Anatomy of a Charity, covers all the different types of nonprofits and helps distinguish them. And the Common Legal Issues Nonprofit Board's Experience, if you get your nonprofit started, there are probably some things in there you need to know because it's more about, it goes beyond how do I start a nonprofit. It's more on, what will come up and how do I handle issues once they come up. If you go to the blog Maggie mentioned, you'll find it. If you search C4NPR Toledo on YouTube, those should pop up. They are posted on YouTube. So when does it make sense to form a nonprofit? You've got a great idea. You want to start a nonprofit, but you need to consider whether it makes sense to do that. So who wouldn't want to start a nonprofit? A new nonprofit is kind of like this little puppy here. You think, if I start a nonprofit, it's mine. It's brand new, and new things are exciting. I can name it. I can name it anything I want. If I started it, I'm the founder. I'll always be the founder, so it will always love me, right? And if we just start a little nonprofit, it's just small, and it's not going to be a lot of trouble, right? Well, that's true perhaps in the very beginning, but fast forward not too much longer, and you got a big dog now. It's not so new anymore. It consumes my time and money, just like a 100-pound dog. It's not always playtime. I've got to clean up after it. You have responsibilities toward it that just like a dog, although not quite so physically messy. And finally, I didn't realize it was such a big responsibility. But like a dog, once you've formed a nonprofit and the maintenance obligations have started, you've got to, you have to maintain it or do something with it. You can't just let it go. The reality of nonprofits is forming the corporation is the easiest part. Beyond just forming the corporation, you need Internal Revenue Service recognition that it's an actual charity. You need to make annual filings with the Internal Revenue Service and with the Ohio Attorney General. A nonprofit needs a source of ongoing revenue. I have not yet seen a nonprofit that doesn't need money. Usually, I don't think I've seen many that don't need a lot more money than what they have. Running a nonprofit literally involves running a small business, but with more regulations. If you're operating a nonprofit that does something, you pretty much have the same responsibilities you would with a small business, but again, there are more regulations that apply, more reporting. Sure, you're not paying taxes, but there are a lot of other things that you need to keep in mind. And finally, fiduciary responsibilities. Fiduciary is in red because it's important. Fiduciary means that you have a responsibility not just to yourself and not even just to the organization. You have a responsibility to the public when you run a charity. And people who don't take those responsibilities seriously can wind up in trouble in court, with IRS, with the Attorney General. So it's a greater level of responsibility than you have with a typical small business. So what are some factors that would suggest in favor that maybe you should start a nonprofit? If you have an idea that's so unique that no other nonprofit does that thing or quite the same thing. If you want greater independence or control, I put an asterisk by that because you need to be careful. There are limits on the amount of independence and control you have with a nonprofit, and you don't own the nonprofit. Even if you're the founder, you don't own it, nobody owns it. If you have substantial business experience, you know how to run a business, so you can do the back office stuff yourself. If you have a long-term commitment to that cause, you want to start an institution that's going to last 20 years, 30 years, a lifetime, maybe beyond your lifetime. If you have a strong funding model in place, so you know where the money is going to come from to support this nonprofit, those are some factors that suggest maybe you should start your own nonprofit. What are some factors against it? Say there's a compatible nonprofit in town that's willing to partner with you. They're willing to, we'll talk about more what partnering could mean, but there are ways you can work with an existing nonprofit, so you don't need to start your own. Second, you just want to do good. You don't want to run the back office. A lot of people are like this. A lot of people want to start nonprofits. They've got a passion for their cause, but they don't want to be doing paperwork in the back. They don't want to be doing reports and dealing with all of that. They just want to go out and slay some dragons, accomplish some wonderful things. If that's true, you may not want all the responsibility of running the nonprofit. If you lack business experience, then you may not have the technical skills to run the back office, to do all the things that need to be done. If you lack long-term commitment, I've had college students approach me to start a nonprofit. I've seen reports of children starting nonprofits, and it's great to support the cause, and they've done some really wonderful things. But if you start a nonprofit and you have maybe a 1 year or 2 year time window of when you want to do things, you're starting something that is going to last a lot longer than that. So perhaps starting a separate nonprofit may not be the most efficient way of doing it. It can still be done. It may just not be the most efficient one. Then finally, this is a big problem for a lot of nonprofits. If your funding model is unclear or weak, if you're not sure where the money is coming from, or if you're sure where the money is coming from, but it's not enough to do what you want to do, including paying for all of the administrative side, that's a problem. You've seen the movie Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner. He hears this voice telling him to build the baseball diamond in the middle of nowhere. If you build it, they will come. Well, if you build your nonprofit, it's not clear that the money will come. So you need to have a good funding model to make sure that the nonprofit's going to survive. So you tell me, all right, I've heard the factors for and against. I'm ready for the big dog. I want to do this. I want to start my own nonprofit. So what's next? This is a summary, and then we'll go through the steps in more detail in a bit. First, write a business plan for your nonprofit. I've heard people tell me, why should I write a business plan? This is not a business, it's a nonprofit. Well, a nonprofit, in a way, is a business. You need a business plan. You need to know, as I said, where the money is coming from, how you're going to spend the money. Is it realistic? If you don't know before you start what the plan is, if you don't have a realistic plan before you start, then you're going to run into trouble later. Of course, everything changes. No matter how good the plan is, reality will be different. But if you don't have any kind of plan, you're just setting yourself up for trouble later. Second, select a board with diverse skills. When I say diverse skills, you probably need somebody on the board who understands financial statements. It could be an accountant, could just be somebody who is good with numbers and knows how to read a balance sheet. If you're serving a particular community with your nonprofit, it might be good to have someone from that community. If it's for people with disabilities, perhaps have someone with disabilities on the board, or the parent of a child with disabilities, so someone from your constituency group. If you're seeking funding from particular groups, that's sometimes you have people who are good at fundraising, people who are good at marketing. You probably don't have all of the skills that you need to start your nonprofit, and that's okay if you seed the board with people who have the skills that you don't have. So the board, with all of its diverse skills, is going to be stronger than one person. If you only select your friends who have the same interests and skills that you do for your board, or family members with the same skills and interests, then you're not going to be ready for some of the challenges that you face. Third point, you should involve a lawyer and an accountant who understand nonprofits to help you get started. Not all lawyers and not all accountants know how nonprofits work. I actually had a course on nonprofit law in law school, but very, very few people actually study this. Few people don't study it in law school, but pick it up later, and you can gain competence in this without studying it in particular. But it's not something that you automatically know or can pick up just by the fact that you have a law degree or a CPA certificate. So after that, form the nonprofit, and we'll go into that in a little more detail. And after the nonprofit is formed, you want to establish a separate bank account. A separate bank account is extremely important. If you say, well, establishing a separate bank account, that's going to cost some money, I'll save a few dollars and I'll just kind of keep track of it on paper. That's called commingling. Commingling is a really bad word in nonprofits. It means you're mixing assets that belong to the charity with your own personal assets. And even if you keep scrupulous track of it, it's a really bad idea. So please don't do that. Make sure you establish a separate bank account as soon as the nonprofit is formed. So how do I form a new nonprofit? We've talked about there are steps. Let's go through those steps. First of all, you need articles of incorporation. The articles of incorporation are filed with the state, and that's how the corporation gets formed. Next, code of regulations. That's an internal document. You need to obtain an employer identification number from the Internal Revenue Service. Once you get that, you need to file the Form 1023 with the Internal Revenue Service in order to be recognized as a charity. You need to register with the Ohio Attorney General, and then there's some other documents we'll go through in a moment. So this is what articles of incorporation look like. There's a state mandated form. You can either print the form out, fill it in, or you can type it. It's a PDF. You can type in the blanks, print it out and send it back by fax or send a scan, or you can actually just file it online. You don't have to use this actual form. There's a place on the website where you can just fill in the blanks. The filing time is really fast on these. They'll tell you it can be a week or so, and you can pay extra to get expedited service. But lately, I've been seeing these come back usually within 2 business days, and so the filing time has been really fast. You can pay more to get it faster, but unless you have an extreme emergency, it's probably a waste of money to do that because it doesn't take very long at all. You need to insert a unique name for the nonprofit. You can search the database to see if anybody else has your name. If your name is really similar to another name, you may have to get permission from the other company to use that name. but let's assume it's a name that nobody's used before. You do not have to put Inc., Corp., Corporation, Incorporated. You don't need to use any of those words for a nonprofit. You do for a for-profit. You're allowed to use it for a nonprofit, but you don't have to. I literally once named an organization Fred, the neighborhood organization. It was a legitimate organization, but it was a little bit of a joke. I think if you go to the Secretary of State website, you can look up Fred, the neighborhood organization. I think it's defunct, but you can still find a reference there. So you can name it just about anything. The effective date, usually we leave that blank, and that means it'll be effective when it gets filed. You can specify a date in the future if you don't want it to be effective until later. Usually that doesn't matter. Now the purposes clause, you see that big blue box there. It says you can put anything else you want here. You can file articles without a purposes clause. They will not be qualified as a 501c3 charity if you do that. The purposes clause is extremely important, and we'll go into the details of that in a little bit. So this is what the second page looks like. The second page, you name a statutory agent. Who is the statutory agent? That's just the person who gets the official mail. The importance of the statutory agent is you want an address that's going to be very stable. If you're the founder and you've lived in the same place for 10 years and you intend to live there for another 30, maybe that's a good address as long as you stay with the organization. I, as an attorney, and a lot of attorneys will serve as statutory agent. We typically don't charge anything for that. And if we get mail for you, we'll forward it on. You can hire a third-party service. There are about a half dozen that you can pay several $100s a year to do this. But if it's a local nonprofit, it seems a little pointless. But what I wouldn't do is name someone who is not going to be with the organization a long time, because frequently that person is no longer with the organization, or they move, mail goes to the organization that's important. It's been legally served to the organization, but then nobody gets it because nobody knows it's there. So please choose a very stable address for your statutory agent. The articles need to be signed by the incorporator. The incorporator has a very temporary role. Both the statutory agent's name and the incorporator's name are on the public record. Sometimes I will serve as incorporator for my clients, and then my name is there, and I don't really have any responsibility other than forming the entity, and then I'm gone. Because some clients want to keep their names off of it. Sometimes you'll have a long list of incorporators. There are 7 founders, and they all want their name to be, they all want to serve as incorporators. They all want their names in the public record, and that's fine too. It just changes from one organization to the next. The filing fee for the articles is $99, which is really inexpensive. It's one of the least expensive parts of this. Remember the puppy. It's not what you often, not how much the puppy costs, it's how much it's going to cost over the lifetime. So this is a very small fee. As I said, you can pay extra to get it expedited, but typically that's not worth the effort. So what else do you need in the articles? Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, which is the part that describes what a charity is, has some very strict requirements. You need a detailed purposes clause that's compliant with 501c3. Essentially, the purposes need to be exclusively for charitable, educational. There are a list of purposes that you can have, but the organization has to be formed exclusively for those purposes. There needs to be a clause saying there's no private inurement, which means you can't take money from the nonprofit and use it for private purposes. You can pay salaries, you can pay reasonable wages, you can pay for reasonable, proper kind of things, but you can't take the leftover money and split it up among the board or the members. We usually include a paragraph limiting political activity. The political activity is beyond the scope of this seminar, but just as a really rough guide, let's say you cannot support a candidate by any means at all. You can't endorse a candidate as an organization. You have some limited ability to promote particular issues, but that can't be the focus of the organization. And then finally, the consequences upon dissolution. So what does that mean? Say the corporation is going to be dissolved and we've got money left over. Where does that money go? Typically, there's a clause that says it can go to another nonprofit that has similar purposes. Well, say you started the Capybara Rescue Foundation, and there aren't any other Capybara Rescue Foundations around that you can find. What do you do with the leftover money? Typically, then, it says that the court, if we're here in Toledo, the Lucas County Court of Common Pleas, can decide where to spend the money in a way that is consistent with the purposes of the organization. So the capybaras are kind of like giant guinea pigs. So perhaps there's a guinea pig foundation, or there's a South American section at the Toledo Zoo, and they've got capybaras, so we can use that money to support those capybaras. So often the articles say whether there are members of the organization. Usually for a charity, there will be no members. Sometimes there is one member that's another charity, but you typically don't have lots of members in a nonprofit the way that there are in a private club. Let me restate that. A charity typically doesn't have a lot of members. A nonprofit that's not a charity, like a private club, may have a lot of members. So typically the articles say there are no members. You can say the number of directors. Typically you need at least 3 directors, and you can have as many as you want. There are some circumstances where you could have 1 or 2 directors, but it's often stated in the articles. And finally, the amendment process. If you don't specify how the articles are amended, then the members, if you have them, or the directors, can amend them by a simple majority. Often organizations will provide a higher threshold to make it a little harder to change the articles. So going back on this slide, these are the things that are typically added to the articles of incorporation that aren't automatically included. So that blue box on the first page where I said you can put extra provisions, when I do it, usually it says see attachment, and then I've got a couple pages that have all of this other language that you really need for a charity. Those get attached to the articles, and those get submitted along with the articles of incorporation. So those are the articles. Next, the Code of Regulations. I'm not going into a lot of detail on the Code of Regulations, but this is page 1 of a document that I sometimes use. The Code of Regulations is an internal governance document. So that means it covers the relationship between the directors and the organization. It talks about board committees, meetings, how you vote, how the directors get appointed, all of those things. If you have members, it does the same thing for members. So it's an internal governance document. It's not published online like the articles. It's still technically a public document, because if someone requests to see the Code of Regulations, you can't say, oh, it's a trade secret. We don't share that with anyone. So if someone requests, you need to disclose it. It's also disclosed with your Form 1023, so it becomes part of the public record. And it needs to work in tandem with the articles. So if you have provisions for amendment here and provisions for amendment in the Articles of Incorporation, they can't contradict one another. I guess if there is a contradiction, the articles would override the Code of Regulations, but it's awkward if they don't work together. That creates an ambiguity, and that's a bad thing. So what types of provisions does the Code of Regulations have? For the directors and for the members, if you have any, it says, who can be a director? Are there qualifications? Do you have to be a dues-paying member? Do you have to live in a particular community? Do you just have to express an interest in the cause? How are the directors elected or appointed, and how are they removed? Often, a charity without members will have a board that they elect themselves every year or every several years. Sometimes one or more members, or one or more directors might be appointed by a third party. For example, in healthcare, you have nonprofits sometimes where the sole member is another nonprofit, and then the sole member can appoint those directors and remove them at will. So all of that needs to be spelled out here. Also, how do the directors meet and vote? How often do they meet? Who can call a meeting? When they vote, is it straight majority? Do you need a certain number of votes? Do you need a higher than majority percentage to carry the vote? All of those things need to be spelled out here. And also the duties and responsibilities of the directors are listed here also. All of these things, in some sense, they're optional because the Ohio Nonprofit Corporation Law has a lot of rules that apply if the Code of Regulations don't have anything more specific. But the problem is the Ohio Nonprofit Corporation Law is sort of a not one size fits all, maybe one size fits some. So if you just rely on what's in the Code of Regulations, it's probably not going to be tailored the way you want for your organization. And so that's why we have the Code of Regulations. The bottom point, committees. Committees are optional. A lot of organizations that have a large board that meets every several months will have an executive committee. Often the executive committee is made up of the officers, and they might meet once a month or maybe even more often to make decisions in between board meetings, and then the board can ratify those decisions. That executive committee is completely optional. If you've got 3 people on your board, you don't need an executive committee. If you've got 15 people on your board and you meet every 3 months, then you probably do. You can have other committees. Again, this isn't required, but some organizations have a nominating committee, a finance committee, ethics committee, you name it. You can have a committee for just about anything. And a committee is typically a subset of the board, although sometimes a committee will have a director as the chair and maybe some of the members, and might have people who aren't directors on the committee. Committees have powers delegated to them by the board through the Code of Regulations. So typically the committee reports to the board, and the board is a higher authority, so the board can overrule the committee if necessary. But again, you don't need a committee. It's just, this is optional. What else is in the Code of Regulations? The officers are named. You must have president, secretary, treasurer. That's in the Ohio Revised Code. You can have as many other officers as you want. Who can be an officer? Do they have to be a director? How are they elected or appointed? How are they removed? What are their duties and responsibilities? Same as the officers, same as the directors. There are some provisions in the Ohio Revised Code on what their duties are, but you probably want to spell it out in more detail. Often a Code of Regulations will have a conflict of interest policy. I like to have a separate policy, but you can put it in the Code of Regulations. Often the Code of Regulations will provide for indemnification of directors and officers. Sometimes they provide for indemnification of employees and volunteers. So if someone gets sued because they're an officer of the organization, does the corporation have to indemnify them? Does it have to back them up? We almost universally recommend director and officer insurance to protect the people, because the nonprofit may not have the funds to indemnify them, and you want to make sure the policy and the indemnification clause in the Code of Regulations work together, that they don't conflict. I said you need to get an employer identification number. This is what the form looks like, although typically we don't fill out the form anymore. It's quickest to file online. Across the bottom, I put the short URL for how you apply for an EIN online. As you can see, it's a lot of characters. If you don't have time to write that down, or that's a lot of work, you can search online, but make sure you only use an irs.gov site. I did a search when I was putting this together, and I found probably a dozen sites that will get you the EIN. they'll charge you $300 or more to do something that's free if you go to the IRS site and do it yourself. And they don't do it any better, I'm sure. I mean, it only takes about 10 minutes if you know what you're doing to do it at the IRS website. I can't imagine a commercial site is any better than that. So make sure you use irs.gov only. Also, if it's not irs.gov, is it a legitimate site or is it a scam? I don't know. You do have to enter a social security number for the person applying when you get this. And if it's not, I sort of trust the IRS with my social security number. I'm not going to trust a commercial site with my social security number. I mean, who knows what would happen to it. So you can apply by yourself, but make sure you go to the right site. So you got your EIN, and you use that when you file Form 1023. Form 1023 is the form that goes to the Internal Revenue Service where you make the case that you are a charity and they should recognize you as a charity. So if you're small enough, you can use Form 1023 EZ. EZ is clever IRS humor for the short version of the form. So you can use the EZ if you have less than $50,000 in annual gross receipts, less than $250,000 in total assets, and if you qualify after you fill out a simple eligibility worksheet. And by simple, I mean it's 10 pages and has 30 questions. Some of them are rather detailed. But if you can answer all of those questions properly and you qualify, you can do the 1023 EZ. The great thing about the EZ, you can file it electronically. It's an electronic only filing. It's only 3 pages and the filing fee is only $275. So if you can qualify for that, that's the way to go. But remember, you have to answer 30 questions over 7 pages to see if you qualify. If you don't qualify, then you fill out the normal Form 1023. The 1023 is 30 pages of goodness plus exhibits. Of course, most of the pages when you file your 1023 will be blank. The 1023 has a lot of detail. You tell your organization's story in words and numbers. So there's one open-ended question that says, tell us about your organization, your purposes, and your proposed activities. If you put a paragraph in there, that's not going to be enough. You need to really take this chance to explain why your organization is great. You should provide a lot of detail, but you shouldn't provide any information that contradicts your story. And then the numbers, you provide pro forma financials for 3 years, and the pro forma financials should be realistic, and they should also mesh with your story. They should be congruent with one another. So wow, I've filed this form. How long does it take the Internal Revenue Service to approve it? First, the form sits around in the office. I think we file in the Cincinnati office, which is actually on the Kentucky side. It sits there for a while. If you file a long Form 1023, it sits there for 9 months before it gets assigned to a specialist. The EZ is only 3 months. So there's an advantage of the EZ if you qualify. After that, it gets put into one of 2 groups. So somebody finally looks at it and they'll either decide, yes, I can approve this just as it is, or it requires additional information. Now, requires additional information could be 2 or 3 questions that you didn't quite answer properly, or it could be a list of 21 different issues where they want more information. If you get a list back with 21 points on it, you're probably not going to get approved. That's probably their way of saying, we're going to deny you, but we're going to give you a chance to submit more information. So say it's approvable as submitted, it may still take another 3 months after they say, yes, all fine, we approve you. It can take another 3 months before you get your exemption letter. The exemption letter is what proves you are a charity. And this is what an exemption letter looks like. This is one I found online, so it's public, and it's not my client, but it is public. So the exemption letter is usually retroactive to the incorporation date if you filed on time. If you look at this, the fine print, it was issued on June 5th, 2020. The effective date was June 19, 2019. I would bet that this organization was incorporated on June 19 of 2019. And since it's retroactive, that means if they got donations during that retroactive period, those still qualify as charitable contributions. So that's why you want it to be retroactive. This letter also says that the charity is a public charity, that it's not a private foundation. That's important. Private foundations have additional restrictions on what they do. They pay a small tax on their on the corpus, on the money that they have, and there are some distribution requirements. So you want to be a private foundation if you can, if you qualify. Often a charity will show this letter to donors to say, look, we're a real charity and you can donate to us. You can also verify that a charity is real by looking it up online. And I think the anatomy of a charity is where we talked about that other podcast, so you can get more information there if you like. You also need to do an Ohio charitable registration if you formed in Ohio. You can register online. You may need to register as a charitable trust. There are some charities that don't have to register as a charitable trust. There are some exceptions. I can help figure that out, but they're kind of rather technical. For example, a parent booster organization for a school typically doesn't need to register. So there are some organizations that don't need to register. The URL at the bottom is how you find the registration page. Charitable solicitation can apply to organizations that aren't charities. There are professional fundraisers. If you ever get a call from the Police Patrolmen's Association, there's some guy with a gravelly voice who sounds like a retired cop, who's probably just some guy sitting in a boiler room who's never been a cop. Those organizations are supposed to register for charitable solicitation so they can send mail or make phone calls asking for contributions. They have to be registered to do that, and that's separate from the charity registration. What about other states? Well, if you form your nonprofit in Ohio and you're just doing activities and fundraising in Ohio, then you wouldn't have to register in other states. I have some clients that are national organizations, and it's a dilemma for them. If you're a huge mega nonprofit, you can afford to register in all 50 states and be compliant. If you're small, it can be difficult. So I don't have a really good answer on that, but technically everywhere you are making solicitations, you need to register with that state. I think 45 states, almost every state requires registration, but all of the standards for registration are different. The responsibilities are different. So that can be a dilemma if you have a small organization and you're trying to take it nationwide. So what else do you need? Incorporation documents. This is where the incorporator makes a record of what that person did. The directors are appointed. Usually the directors have initial resolutions where they enact the code of regulations and such. If it's not in the code of regulations, you need a separate conflict of interest policy, and I like to have a separate policy. I like to cover it in more detail. Often you'll have an annual conflict certification. You will have your directors, perhaps your employees and volunteers every year certified they don't have any conflicts. So these are not required by the Internal Revenue Service, but these just help square everything away for your organization. What else do you need? If you have employees, you should have an employee handbook. Remember, if you're an employer, you have the same responsibilities as an employer, more or less. If you have volunteers, you should have a volunteer handbook. The current wisdom is you should choose your volunteers as carefully as you would hire employees. Even though you're not paying them, you may think, hey, free labor, I'll take all of the volunteers I can get. Some volunteers could be dangerous and could subject your organization to liability. So be careful with your volunteers, have a code of conduct and such for them. I mentioned the director and officer insurance policy. That's a really nice thing to have if you're on the board, to know that if you get sued, you have insurance and you're not paying out of pocket. Other appropriate insurance policies, if you own property, liability, the same as any other business, that's not a lot different in that respect. Then finally, most nonprofits have websites and social media. This is not required, but as part of your marketing, how do you get the message out there that you exist? If people look you up, do they think you're legitimate? So today, you pretty much need a website and social media accounts to get your message out and convince people that you're real. So what are my ongoing responsibilities? Reporting requirements: you need to file IRS Form 990 or equivalent each year. You need to file with the Ohio Attorney General each year. You have, as I mentioned, if you're an employer, you have responsibilities the same as a nonprofit employer, very similar. You may be responsible for sales tax, depending on what you're doing. You must conduct regular board meetings. If you have them at least once a year, probably a lot more often than that. If you have members, the members need to meet at least once a year. Then Form 990 series that you file with IRS, here are the cutoffs. It's easy if you qualify for low gross receipts and low assets. If you have gross receipts under $50,000, you file the 990N, which takes about 5 minutes online. Technically, if you don't file, there's a $20 a day fine for late filings. They typically have to be filed by May 15 if you're on a 12/31 fiscal year, or you can get an extension. If you don't file any type of 990 for 3 consecutive years, your exemption is revoked. So all of that work you went through for the 1023 goes away. You have to start over. What alternatives are there to forming a new nonprofit? So what if I don't want to feed the big dog? I don't want all of that responsibility. So you can work with an existing nonprofit. Often there is a nonprofit, let's go to my Capybara Rescue Fund. If there's not a Capybara Rescue Fund out there, there might be a South American Animal Rescue Fund, and you could work with them. Even if you only care about capybaras, they may be happy to have you work in that part of their mission, and because that's consistent with their mission. If that's the case, you're with that other organization and they're responsible for what you do. So you would be joining an existing nonprofit. Second, sometimes there's a national nonprofit and they have local chapters. So if there's a national nonprofit and they don't have a local chapter where you are, you could approach them. They might charter you as a local chapter, and then you report your numbers to them and you're under their group exemption, and they file with IRS and do all of that stuff for all of the organizations together. And then finally, this is a really unusual, I've done this before, but it's a really unusual solution to this. If you have a cause and you can basically raise your own money, you want to be semi-independent, it's possible to form a nonprofit LLC with an existing nonprofit as the member. So the existing member is still responsible for you, so you would still need to report your financials to them, but by having a separate nonprofit, you can keep it legally distinct. So it's separate, and I say potentially detachable, because under the right circumstances, you can actually detach that nonprofit and attach you detach the nonprofit LLC. You could affiliate with a different nonprofit member, or turn it into a standalone nonprofit. That's kind of complicated, but I've used that in a couple situations where someone didn't want to start their own nonprofit, but they wanted to maintain independence. So that's a possibility. So that concludes the presentation. I am happy to answer any questions that anyone might have concerning any of this.
Great, thank you, Craig. We have one question already in the Q&A and then a couple of others. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and type them in the Q&A. The one we have already is, how do you make a business plan when you have no formal education in this regard? And Heather, that might be something you can speak to as well.
Sure. One, in the same way that we have a great collaboration with the Toledo Bar Association, we also have a great collaboration with SCORE Northwest Ohio. So you can contact them for a free consultation, and they will help you work through the process of establishing a business plan. Also, any of the technical questions around funding related to the CARES Act, the PPP, et cetera, anything coming up like that, you can go to the Small Business Development Center. So there are also lots of great tools available through our website, c4npr.org. And if you want some additional, but probably really high level support, you could request some technical assistance. That's a fancy word for a consultation with us here. And again, you can go on to the website, c4npr.org, and submit. When you click on getting help, oh, you know what? I was going to say I can share, but I can tell you. You can click on getting help, and the last option below that, on that screen, on that menu, is submit a request for technical assistance. So there's a couple options there.
Great. Craig, this one is for you. Who should be able to access the bank account? Which directors or who do you suggest have access to that?
Ideally, it depends in part on the size of the organization, whether you have, what type of staff you have. But if it's a small organization that's all volunteers, I would perhaps have the treasurer and perhaps the president, and I would probably require dual signatures for a lot of things. I'm not sure if the banks are perfect at implementing this, but you can require 2 signatures for anything over $50 or something. Typically, when a nonprofit has expenses, they're not emergency expenses, or if they are emergency expenses, someone can put it on a credit card and be reimbursed or something like that. But yeah, I would keep that very close. I would often require 2 signatures, and I would be aware that financial fraud in nonprofits is unfortunately fairly common. You read stories in the news about people embezzling money. So whoever is in charge, you need to have checks and balances, because the board has some responsibility. If the board hires a low-level clerk and just says, that's our financial person, we don't worry about it, and that person steals money, the board could have financial responsibility for that.
Great. We have another question. How do you pay for startup costs, meaning the cost of filing and things like that? The person asking says, I assume the founder pays the filing costs out of their own pocket, but do you reimburse yourself once the nonprofit is up and running and has donations or fundraising income?
Yes, that's a good question. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg. If you have to start the corporation before you open the bank account, how do you pay for expenses? So you're absolutely right. Typically, the founder will pay those costs, keep receipts, get reimbursed, and the organization will keep that documentation to show that when we paid the founder this $700, it was to reimburse for out-of-pocket expenses, and it's not compensation.
Great. You mentioned that there's discretion, but do you have a suggestion on how many directors, if there's too many or too few?
It depends on the organization. I have seen effective organizations with as few as 3 directors and as many as 15 or so. I've been on some boards that had more than 20, and that gets pretty unwieldy. It's hard to get that many people in a room at one time, or these days even on a Zoom call at one time. And often if you have too many board members, everyone feels like it's a formality. It's not a big responsibility. So it can be hard to get people to work if you've got too many. On the other hand, if it's too few, it can be hard to collect all of the skills you need on the board. So I've seen some organizations that have a board of directors, and then they'll have an advisory board, and then the advisory board is non-fiduciary, and some of the people on the advisory board are there for their marketing expertise, or because they're donors, or because they know donors. So you need a board that's going to work, that's going to get things done, and it can vary from organization to organization. But too small, you don't have enough skills. Too big, nothing gets done.
Got it. How long does it take to obtain an EIN?
About 10 minutes if you know what you're doing. It's very, if you have all the information together, it's very fast. And that letter, I didn't show the letter. You get a letter by PDF at the end of the 10 minutes or so that has the EIN on it. So as long as the internet's working, it's lightning fast.
Got it. Okay, this one is back to the topic of registering in other states. I assume most local nonprofits should register in Ohio and Michigan since we're so close to the border, and will likely have contributors in Michigan as well. Is that what you see?
It depends on what you're doing. The charitable trust registration, if basically your assets and operations are in Ohio, then that's where the charitable trust registration would be made. Charitable solicitation, if you were doing a direct mail campaign in Michigan, or if you were randomly calling people in Michigan to ask for money, yes, you absolutely need to register as a charitable solicitor there. If you have, I don't know, there can be a gray area, but if you, on the other end of the spectrum, if you have events in Ohio and people from Michigan happen to be at those events and they give you money, then you're not soliciting in Michigan. So I can draw those two poles where in both cases you've got Michigan contributors, but one you definitely need to register, the other one you don't. The gray area comes in, what if you have sometimes at the cash register, there'll be a little sign say donate money to this charity. That probably requires registration as well. If you're having events in Michigan where you're soliciting, you probably need to register as well. But if you just have Michigan people who happen to be in Ohio at your event give you money, then I don't think you need to. Also, if you have a social media presence or a website and people respond to that and send you money and you're not soliciting them, I don't think you need to register then either, because the website is kind of nowhere and everywhere at the same time. I don't think there's a lot of clear law. I would be reluctant to say that if you just have a website, you have to register in all 50 states and potentially around the world because your website goes everywhere. It's possible we may end up there someday, but currently I think that would be overbroad. So if you just have a website and social media and people are donating from around the country, I don't think you're specifically soliciting in any of those other states. I'm not sure that all the attorney generals would agree with me, but that seems reasonable.
Okay, great. Heather, do you have anything else before we wrap up?
Yeah, I had a couple of quick questions, really based on common questions we get, Craig. Mm-hmm. So, can I accept donations before I receive the letter of determination from the IRS?
You can, and as long as you get the determination letter and it's retroactive, then those contributions would be charitable contributions. But it's a little bit of a gray area there too, because if you end up not getting your exemption letter for whatever reason, then those were not charitable contributions. So what you should not do is misrepresent yourself. If you say we're a charity or we're a 501c3 charity before you have your exemption letter, that may wind up being true, but at the time you say it, it's not true. And I would say that's misleading and that shouldn't be done. I think it's okay to say we're a nonprofit, we're in the process of applying for our 501c3 designation. If you're honest and forthright about that, then I think that's fine. and then if anybody asks, you can give it to them in more detail. But while it's pending, you're unlikely to get large donations from people who care about the donation or the charitable contribution deduction, because it's uncertain at that point.
Great. Just to clarify, are bylaws the same or different from the Code of Regulations?
Oh, that's a great question. Ohio is a little bit unique because what almost the rest of the world calls bylaws, we call a Code of Regulations. It's almost exactly the same thing. There's a technical answer that goes a little bit beyond that, but if in pretty much any other state, they're going to call them bylaws, and they do the same thing.
Okay. And for those who might not know, what's a 990?
The 990 is to a charity what the Form 1040 is to you as a regular person. You file a tax return every year, and 990 is like that. It's called an information return because charities don't normally pay tax, but it's the annual return that they file that says what, describes what income they have and all of that. It's like a tax return for somebody who doesn't pay taxes.
And what are pro forma financials?
Pro forma financials are a projection. So that I guess that's just accountant talk for projection. So when I said you need 3 years of pro forma financials for the 1023. So you project out for the next 3 years what your revenue, expenses, and such are going to be, and you put that information on the Form 1023. So you're just projecting for 3 years.
Right. And to state the obvious, that's why it's important to do the business plan so that you can include those projections and where your income and your expenses are expected to come from.
That's right. There's no legal requirement for a business plan, but there's no legal requirement for a business plan when you start a small business with your own money either. But it would be risky to go forward, essentially create a business without a business plan. A nonprofit it's a business. It's a business nobody owns, but it's a business.
And Maggie, this is a question that I know you can help with. How can I get help completing and submitting the 1023 form?
Yeah, thank you, Heather. So through the Toledo Bar Association, we have a program called Nonprofit Connect, where we have volunteer attorneys who are willing to help local nonprofits if they are not able to hire an attorney. So if you find yourself in a position where you need legal assistance and your organization can't afford an attorney, you can reach out to us and we can do an intake and try to find you a volunteer attorney. You can find out more about that through toledobar.org. The program is called Nonprofit Connect, and that'll give you our contact information and how to get a hold of us to apply for pro bono legal services.
Yeah, it is such a wonderful collaboration with the Toledo Bar Association. Nonprofit Connect is not limited to that topic. So if you decide to start a nonprofit and you get up and running, please keep them in mind should you ever need some pro bono assistance down the road. They have some select topics that they help with. And Craig, as always, I just want to thank you for taking the time to share your expertise. I know it's greatly appreciated out in our community, particularly this topic, because we know some people head on down the road and say, oh, if I only knew this before I headed on down the road. Doesn't mean they wouldn't have not pursued a nonprofit, but maybe could have saved themselves some time and perhaps some money. So thank you so much. And for all the people who registered, we will send out a link to the replay when it's available on YouTube. Usually takes us a day or so to render it and get it loaded out there. And I hope that you are signed up for our e-news, because that's where we make excitements about other exciting programs such as this one that we provide and work with our partners to help you, our nonprofit clients, out in the field. So I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Heather.